I want to thank everybody very much for joining us here today for this interview with Kevin O'Brien. Kevin O'Brien is a senior risk engineer with Zurich Financial Services, and I've known Kevin for quite some years. I met him when he was with Brightstar, and Kevin has a wealth of knowledge and experience in the transportation industry. And as a senior risk engineer, he also now has kind of a different perspective of risk to cargo, supply chain, and global supply chains. Kevin, please, everybody will be able to have a chance to read your bio down below, but please give us a brief summary of some of the experience which you have.
Absolutely. Thank you, George, for this opportunity to discuss global risk with supply chain and logistics security issues. As mentioned, I was the Senior Director of Global Security and Loss Prevention for Brightstar, which is the world's largest distributor of wireless products. Prior to that, with respect to experiences in supply chains, I worked at Merck Pharmaceuticals as well as Nokia, the handheld devices, and had roles and responsibilities specifically in Latin America with respect to supply chain security issues and site security issues for the different assembly, manufacturing, plant operations companies. Security and experiences. I worked as a security consultant, again, predominantly in the Latin America region for Kroll Associates, working on different due diligence, risk analysis, and security projects throughout the region. Again, a lot of it for global manufacturers and distributors with very similar supply chain related issues and risks as I did work with Brightstar and Nokia. And previously, obviously, prior to that, I served in the United States Navy for 7 years. Principally, I was deployed overseas in Latin America, in Colombia, El Salvador, and Panama.
Very good, and we want to thank you very much for your service to the country. Kevin, we talk a lot about theft as one of the big disruptions to people's supply chains, organization supply chains, but I don't think enough attention is paid to other supply chain disruptions that could lead to loss. What are some of the major contributing factors that go into supply chain disruptions?
That's a very good question, George. And from being an insider that I was inside a corporation with senior management at Brightstar, as well now as my present role consulting for a multitude of corporate clients in Zurich as the insurance provider for multiple global corporations. There are other risk factors that can cause delays, additional costs, and disrupt operations within the supply chain. A lot of those can be categorized in two areas as internal and external. And if we consider, well, what are these internal disruptions to the supply chain? You need to really take a very large macro view of the operation to see what they are. At Zurich, we have seen that a lot of these disruptions can come from within the raw materials input supply chain. So in other words, you would have situations in which third parties or contractors or entities that corporations purchase raw materials from have their own unique disruptions in the supply chain that can come about from a lack of raw materials or even disruptions in the distribution process to get them to the assembly plant or the factory. So consideration on that inbound leg of delays that can happen is something that does impact companies that we see that depend on those materials to assemble their product, to manufacture their product, and then the ensuing supply chain operation of the final product that takes place. Other internal disruptions can be problems within the own internal assembly and manufacturing operations of our clients that we've seen that can come with new products that are under new assembly processes for the first time, and there's glitches, so to speak, or problems in the manufacturing process. So those are some of the internal ones we see. Obviously, the external disruptions, natural disasters that can be very unique to the countries and regions globally. We do know that earthquakes and hurricanes and tsunamis have specific unique threats to different geographic regions of the world. we have seen how those have caused disruption, so to speak. Also, political instability or political events in certain countries. It's interesting that a lot of those can cause significant, not just short-term, but long-term disruptions to the supply chain that we have seen. Other external ones, you get to specific regional risk situations for countries, and that can be from very organized crime, such as narco trafficking in certain areas, to either domestic or international terrorism. These are certain realities that can impact very specifically the region and countries they affect, and can cause consequences that cause companies to reconsider and make modifications to their supply chains as a result of those crisis realities in their countries.
That's a very good answer for looking at global supply chains. And a lot of times we don't even really take into account the internal risks, because we speak a lot of the risk to cargo and transit, but supply chain disruptions from internal risk generally are some of the largest disruptions that organizations have. When you look at a supply chain in, say, Latin America as opposed to Asia, now Asia has more natural disasters generally than any other region of the world. How does an organization take those risks into effect given today's global supply chains?
That's a very good question, and it all has to be implemented into two sort of mandatory projects that all corporations have to do with respect to developing the governance models and logistics processes for their companies. And the first one is the risk assessment or risk analysis that, again, is very, very specific to the region, country, and their unique operation. The second aspect after the risk analysis is the crisis management or business continuity preparation and planning that goes in place, addressing the very specific risks that were identified in the risk analysis plan. So we talk about Asia, and we also talk about Latin America. And specifically for Latin America, we do know that there are certain countries and regions that are extremely susceptible to the natural disaster risk of hurricanes and earthquakes. So in those types of countries and regions, within the logistics, distribution, supply chain, and security governance models and protocols to support their transportation operations, they have to have the risk analysis and crisis management plan to deal with situations assuming that they have an earthquake or they suffer the impacts of a hurricane. A lot of the planning on that, to get into some of the fundamental details to give people an idea, is companies will identify alternate locations with respect to original locations that were impacted by the natural disaster, as well as alternate service providers. Again, assuming a sort of worst case scenario in which assets of service providers are impacted by this natural disaster. Along with that, when you get into the exercise and the plan development, you get into other things such as alternate routes that are used to move product, whether it's the inbound and the outbound logistics supply chains that can be impacted by these natural disasters. And what we have seen is that a lot of companies, when they design these crisis management plans, they realize that, wow, as a result of our planning, now we have new service providers, now we have new distribution locations that we have to consider, and now we also have new routing. So it then opens the door for, okay, what's our risk exposure at these new locations? What additional, if any, security precautions we have to take? So in a way, you're sort of creating a parallel supply chain and processes in some scenarios to deal with these identified risks that are dealt with in each specific crisis management plan. And in this scenario that we looked at for hurricanes and earthquakes in Latin America.
And it's really interesting to me that a lot of organizations these days, they do talk about their crisis planning, But a few years ago, it seemed like when we had the volcano in Iceland and several other events, it almost caught the logistics industry by surprise. Are they doing anything different these days to try to predict certain risks?
Yes, and at Zurich Financial Services, we try to do that. We communicate actively and in a proactive manner. We foment this proactive relationship to get companies to think about different crisis scenarios that can happen both for internal reasons that we discussed previously and also the external factors such as natural disasters, political risks that we discussed. And what we are seeing is that a lot of companies have proactively taken steps to conduct risk analysis and identify the specific and unique problem scenarios that could impact them, as well as the corresponding crisis management or business continuity planning that is developed. George, it's also important to note that there is a cost factor involved in this. And from the insurance industry, we do see the cost impact that these disruptions, whether they're internal or from external factors, can cause companies. One specific example is large shipping companies, global shipping companies that may go out of business. And the specific disruption is a stoppage in maritime cargo ship movement, and then to identify, well, which global customers have cargo containers on those ships and how many port facilities are now stopped because the shipping company went out of business. So again, that's a business continuity crisis management scenario in which companies as well have to develop contingency plans. So it's a huge financial impact if you're talking about precious materials or finished product that has to go to market. You're looking at the loss of the sales opportunity as well in the delayed and the costs and the risk, the inefficiencies that go with that.
And you know, Kevin, I think a lot of people don't think about something as significant as one of these major maritime services that go out of business. We recently had one in China. What would be the global impact to most organizations if an organization like Maersk actually went belly up?
Correct. And we also had the last line, I think it was Hanjin, that recently had problems globally. And without getting into specifics, you had companies perhaps in one group that had containers of product that was stuck now at certain port facilities globally. And their business continuity crisis issue was, okay, what is now an alternate shipping method? And then you had companies perhaps in another category or block that was, wow, we have containers of product on these ships. What's the process to get them off location and then come up with a plan for shipping? You mix the element of that in with respect to products or materials that perhaps are sensitive to the time in transit. In other words, temperature sensitivities, or with respect to spoilage. So now you see that any type of crisis business continuity plan has to be all-encompassing to incorporate and consider all those factors to come up with the logistic alternatives and the transporting alternatives for those types of crisis scenarios.
So it's interesting that when you think of an event, and a lot of people in security especially, we used to always prepare for one event at a time. And then you have something crazy that'll happen, like you have a tsunami, which leads, or you have an earthquake, which leads to a tsunami, which leads to a nuclear disaster. I've seen where a port actually went on strike. A port of Baltimore went on strike one time, and a customer of ours had cargo coming into the port of Baltimore. Well, they weren't exactly sure where the was going to go, the cargo. They're kind of at the mercy of the carrier, and it ended up in the port of Montreal. Now, if you don't have, and forgive me for not understanding this myself sometimes when it comes to maritime, if you don't have the proper paperwork to go through Canada because you were expecting to come to the U.S., how much can that impact your supply chain?
Huge.
And how do you prepare for that?
Huge. There are a lot of, what we saw is a lot of legal ramifications with respect to the Hanjin bankruptcy with the Hanjin line. And it brings up a lot of legal issues because you have cargo that is in the process of either of authorization for either import or export at specific ports of embarkation or debarkation. And when you have an issue of a line that goes out of business and there is a takeover, so to speak, of the assets of a certain company, companies today have to be aware of the specific legal ramifications and realities in the different countries globally, and how they have to maneuver those legal that legal reality to provide the crisis management and the business continuity response to find alternative routes for their cargo shipments.
When you are working on a daily basis with your customers, is it disruptions that you're actually looking more for a risk, or is it the actual theft or pilferage of products?
I would honestly say that it is probably both.
Okay.
We would get the disruptions that could be caused via the internal factors, disruption in the inbound materials flow that we mentioned, and also problems within the own assembly, distribution, or manufacturing processes of the company itself. But with respect to theft, we have seen as that also causes disruptions. And I'll give you a perfect example. You can take any medium or high risk region or country in the globe, and a lot of these cargo theft has the same natural tendency to continue to occur with the same carriers or partners involved with the same product until someone comes up with a solution to stop it. So if you have a situation where you have repetitive losses along a specific route, perhaps in the same mode of transport, looking at the same product, then you have a hemorrhaging effect taking place, and somehow there's a weak point in that one part of the operation, and until you put a solution to it or a Band-Aid on it or identify the problem, the criminal element will continue to attack that. So I've seen that repetitive throughout the globe with respect to how organized crime can infiltrate cargo operations and distribution logistics operations to take advantage of certain aspects of it and steal the products that they're looking for. So we have seen where companies have said, okay, we've had X amount of thefts on this route or from this destination or debarkation point. We're going to stop and come up with alternative routing, alternative service providers until we find a solution. So those types of disruptions we've seen in general terms are much more shorter, because you're looking at a solution of the company selecting new 3PLs, new shipping companies, new transportation partners, and perhaps rerouting. But they are very common, and there are companies that have finished product types of items or coveted raw materials, and that also operate in medium or higher risk environments globally, are more susceptible to those types of disruptions.
So when looking at a company's operations, everything obviously used to, well, it seemed like everything used to be outsourced. If you were a US manufacturing company, you outsource that to somewhere in Asia, but now they're calling it near sourcing, where they're kind of outsourcing it to Mexico. So instead of coming across the ocean, it's just taking a truck ride from Mexico up to the US. However, a lot of companies might be engaging in the possibility of near sourcing without understanding the implications of doing business in Mexico and what some of the cartels' challenges are. When a company tries to make those decisions, do they come to you first and say, what will our risk be if we do this? Or do they come to you and say, hey, we've decided to do this, now what do we do about it?
The latter, because what you said, the latter, because what we have to understand as risk engineers in the insurance industry is that there's such a pressure for costs that a lot of companies unwillingly will cut corners with respect to risk analysis. Doing the due diligence, identifying those risks, and then allocating the assets to mitigate those risks. So by human nature, a lot of companies will cut that corner, and at the last minute, somebody will scratch their head and say, okay, we now are going to reroute this to Mexico and then truck it to our distribution locations in the United States. We're going to start in 2 weeks. Okay, have we thought about security and ground transportation security? So we will get that, unfortunately, in most of the cases. And but what we have seen, however, is even though in a lot of cases within a 2-week time period, we can assist the companies to put together the transportation security that's needed to mitigate the risk at the reflective high risk level, which is Mexico. Nevertheless, there are companies that don't do that, and they start this new mode of operation, as you mentioned, and they stop it, or they go back to the original model because, again, they suffer that rash of losses. They weren't prepared on the ground transportation security aspect wise. They had new logistics partners. There was no vetting done. There was no security control mechanisms in the different processes implemented, and they got burned. And again, as we mentioned, they continued to suffer losses because they never identified where the weaknesses are, and the very organized criminal element kept on conducting the thefts until they realized that no one was going to stop it. So I have specifically seen at least half a dozen issues in which companies went to a mode of distribution transportation that directed them to a higher risk area like Mexico, and then they subsequently stopped it because they did not implement the necessary security preparations beforehand.
So maybe a lot of organizations are looking at, well, we'll make these changes and then we'll tell our insurance company what we're doing so we can buy insurance from this lane. But what exactly, as a risk engineer, is it that you help customers to do? Is it, do you actually do risk analysis for them, or are you doing risk analysis for Zurich so that they can understand what the rates will be for these lanes?
It's a combination of both. We will have certain companies and clients ranging from pharma to telecommunications to food processing to the automotive industry. So we do have a wide variety of clients that will proactively engage us in the risk analysis phase. In other words, it's before they're initiating these new operations in these new lanes, new locations, as you discussed. But unfortunately, we will also get situations in which a theft has already occurred, and we as risk engineers go in looking at it on the investigative side, the lessons learned aspect, but then also on the third aspect, what we would also do is assist companies to come up with corrective action planning. So I would go in, look at their existing security processes and protocols, and help improve them based on the threat incidents they had, and implementing corrective actions that we identified from the losses. So in reality, it's pretty much threefold. It's proactive consulting, it's also on the reactive side, and then also a direct partnership. Okay,
I think that helps make that a lot more clear of exactly how the insurance industries can help organizations with more than just their insurance and writing of the cargo. Kevin, one thing that's kind of interesting right now, and I don't like to speak politics really when I'm doing this, but we may have an unprecedented political season this year, I guess, in the U.S. And we have one candidate that says, you know, if I win, we're going to redo some trade deals. When do you start actually looking at the implications of something like government regulation changes? Mm-hmm. If we actually have a turnover of the president to someone like Donald Trump, who says, you know, we're going to make these changes. Do you wait to see if they actually happen and then try to work on these? Or do you start saying right now, what is possible that would change for our lanes and our risk to our customers?
That's a very good question. And I can tell you with all truthfulness that up to this date, I have not received any inquiries from underwriters at Zurich or our existing customers and clients communicating to me with respect to reassessing, so to speak, their transportation logistics exposures as a result of what you're mentioning, more stringent trade laws to move cargo in the United States, specifically with Mexico and NAFTA. I would think that more if post U.S. elections, if there was more definitive information, I would expect an outreach then of questions and inquiries from our clients. But as of this date, I have not received any.
Very good, thank you. Well, the last question I have for you, sir, is when I'm looking at risk in certain regions, when you're going into these different countries and for these different clients, what are some of the things that you can usually tell them right off the bat that help them improve their supply chain security? Or
George, that is an excellent question. And as you mentioned, I've had the great opportunity in my professional career to look at logistics and transportation security in every region of the globe. And there is a lot of commonalities, or so to speak, a common ingredient, a common solution in security and loss prevention. And I will say it is this. Basically, whatever entity you have, whether it's a distributor that's distributing their goods or it's a manufacturer sending their goods to market, either one of those entities is going to be insuring the specific product. And we can even take it on the inbound side for a company that sells raw materials that go to certain factories, again, for assembly. To them, that's their finished product. And the most common element I am seeing that all these different companies are doing that causes them to have theft in the supply chain and causes them not be able to react when they have disruptions is the following. The bigger the distance these entities get from their supply chain distribution partners and their product, the more susceptible they're going to be to having problems. And in the specific case of a company outsourcing and contracting a 3PL, if that company is not conducting supervision of these lanes, of their 3PL, doing quality control, if they're not vetting them with respect to certain standards and quality standards in the transportation, in the warehousing aspects, and in the security, they're going to be more susceptible to theft, shrink, and also the impact of disruptions. And it's all related to the lack of communications, the distancing of communication, the not being in touch to what is going on globally with their product in the supply chain. I see it from Mexico to the United States to Europe and Asia. And those companies that create towers or create control mechanisms with respect to receipt, dispatch, time at location, transit location of cargo, status of cargo, are less susceptible to having problems because they're communicating to their partners in the supply chain that they're on top of what's going on. And it's usually the ones that forget about it and are in a passive mode of getting information from their supply chain partners on the status of their cargo that are the ones that are more susceptible to theft.
Wow, what a great answer, actually, because that's not the answer. A lot of times we hear, well, it's, they're not tracking, or communication is so important. And I think a lot of companies, they think once I've hired this out or once I've outsourced this process, that's right, their job is to take care of it. So they just kind of go hands off with it and expect it to be taken care of. And a lot of times they don't realize how little that company is doing to ensure the safety and the security of their product until they get that phone call that says, we've had a loss.
I guess, George, the best way to summarize it is that supply chain security issues is not always turnkey. You have to provide the supervision. You have to have the direct involvement of internal staff during the critical aspects of the operation. And I'm not just talking about security. It's also the warehousing aspects and the quality implications that certain products, pharmaceuticals, food products, telecommunications equipment, there's a lot of quality standards with respect to packaging and handling and storage. So there always has to be a different set of chimes that go from the entity that has skin in the game, or the one that's the insured, to these different distribution, logistics, and transportation entities that they hire as third parties at the different phases of the operation to ensure quality.
Well, thank you very much for that, Kevin. Kevin, do you have anything you'd like to say to everybody kind of in closing?
Yes, we do see that there are a lot of challenges out there. We recognize that there are potential disruptions on the internal side and the external side. And in general terms, we encourage everyone out there to relook at their exposures globally, come up with those risk analysis, risk identifiers of where you are, and then develop the very specific crisis management and business continuity planning to address each one of the risks you identify.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. I know everybody's going to get a lot of value from this discussion that we've just had today. If anybody has any questions, again, Kevin's bio is below that. Kevin, is it okay if I put your contact information in there? If everybody can contact you?
George. Please do.
Okay, we'll do that. So thank you very much, everybody. We will see you on the next video. Take care.